We just want to welcome you to our BMF webinar this amazing Friday, the 22nd of May. As we know, we are strictly under lockdown. We are on level 3, but while we are on level 3, we are studying, we are learning, we are chatting, we're having discussions. So I just want to welcome you once more from BMF Soweto. I am Sipati Mbogazi. The immediate challenge presented by COVID-19 outbreak is a dire economic paralysis. And unfortunately, it has such a huge impact on the sustainability of our healthcare system. The global outbreak of COVID-19 has, of course, caused severe instability in our markets across the world, and obviously has weakened South Africa's economic woes. I think all of us can agree that our economy is still on shaky ground, and we need to actually have discussions around how do we navigate the post-COVID-19 and to make sure that at the end of the day, our economy does become sustainable. Africa faces an economic contraction of up to 2.6% in 2020. So 2.6% might seem like a very small numbers, but in the bigger scheme of things, the impact on not just on our nation, but on our people is much dire than what we think. The first continent-wide recession in 25 years, and at least 300,000 people could die. When you think about 300,000 deaths, I am one of those people that cringes and says, oh my goodness. It is imperative that, however, for us to ask ourselves, what sort of future do we see post this COVID-19 for South Africa? What does it mean for the rest of the world at large as we come out of this pandemic? Today's webinar session is precisely to examine South Africa's economy during this lockdown and post this lockdown. And what exactly does it mean, not just for our country, but we're going to dig deep into our township economy and what this means globally for our country. So today we've got Kanti Pai, who is an economist and founder of the Nascent Advisory and Research Organization, a business providing bespoke research solution and business advisory services. With an academic background from the University of Cape Town and also the University of London. So we can definitely say that our speaker today is actually educated. Pai has worked in the banking and fund management industry for over 13 years. He also writes a regular column on the Financial Mail and was written for Business Day and Financial Times. So we're going to give an opportunity to talk to us about our economy and what this means as we go through and navigate this COVID-19 pandemic and ultimately the lockdown. We will have a question and answer session post his discussion with us. It's a robust discussion. So I'm going to ask you that there is a chat link on your screen. Send your questions through to us so that we can have this discussion. We can navigate and talk about this COVID pandemic. As I hand over, I ask you that you keep your questions coming through. We do have a team offline that will respond to them, and we will have a chat around some of the questions that you have posed. Over to you, Kanti.
Okay, thank you very much, Sipati. It's really, really great actually to have a discussion with people that you really can't see, because it's much better. You don't feel as intimidated. So I'm looking just at screens. So it's fantastic. But a good afternoon to everyone who's able to join us. Thank you so much for joining us and for this time. And of course, thank you so much to the Black Management Forum, Soweto guys, for the opportunity and for the invitation to be here. Let me just put on my slides there so that you are able to view them. So I'm going to share the screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. Really what we wanted to do is to actually take just a little bit of a look back in terms of where we come from and where we are going. I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is really how things have changed and how this crisis has taught us a number of things about ourselves and certainly about reassessing the world as we understood it and the world as we knew it, and how those lessons and what the lessons we are learning now actually take us into the future. Now, I want to start by talking a little bit about, last year I was about nearly actually 9 months ago. I was giving a talk at a strategy session of a business here in Johannesburg. And these were some of the topics I was talking about. And I think it's interesting because actually it was a time when we thought, globalization was facing its toughest challenges. I think we want to talk, for example, about when we think about the politics of the West, in the UK, in the United States, in terms of the nationalism that has grown there, the leadership that has emerged, really speaking to, I guess, also in emerging markets, Brazil in particular, where people were starting to say, look, this globalization situation, how actually, trade is becoming a problem, or people are being left out, immigration is an issue, all of those issues that have led to things like Brexit, electing nationalist leaders, were sort of a challenge to globalization. But it's interesting now that actually we are finding that that same globalized world is actually presenting a challenge to individual societies. And I think in this sense, if we think about South Africa, for example, if we think about trade patterns being disturbed and being disrupted by this virus, it gives us a sense of where we were and where we thought it was. So if you think about Brexit and trade wars that we were very concerned about 9 months ago, even 3 months ago, it's something that doesn't worry us now, but it actually also worries us that trade we have been so trade dependent, that we depend on other countries in order to produce our own food, electronics, issues of protection, health, protection gear, and all sorts of things that we need that actually sustain our daily lives. And the disruption of trade paths and of trade patterns has meant that we are actually having to live without these things that we are used to. We also talked about, we think about the Africa story. South Africa was going into this big, into chairing the African Union. So we're excited about that. And we're thinking about, silencing the guns and making sure that we are also going to be trading amongst ourselves, this free trade area agreement that we had. And also we're looking at South Africa's reforms. We had a treasury strategy that was new. We were happy, and we were trying to think about whether or not our political system is going to continue to hold. And we think about issues of the ANC. There were also things about their reviewing of policy. So at this time last year, we had a really functioning economy. We were debating the issues of the country and globally. It seems now that some of those challenges and some of those have been muted or actually exacerbated. And I think in the biggest way, this challenge or this pandemic is highlighting really some of the fault lines that we have seen over time. And one of the things that I was using, I like to use this graph, which it talks about really the sense of trade and where we are. And this is what is called the Baltic Exchange Dry Index. And really, it is a graph that shows the prices of putting some of dry commodities on a ship around the world's main trade paths in the world. And I think it talks to us about how it tells us about the activity that we see. Where you see that round red border tells us about what was happening during those trade wars, right, when the China and the US were starting to fight, and that those prices are the index actually slowing. But look at where it has slowed to today, given of course the disruption after a really good recovery. And then in the long term, though, if you look at that in the long term, and we thought that this had implications for emerging markets because of course we depend a lot on commodities. And the idea there was to say, what are we going to do as emerging countries? What are we going to do in Africa to think about improving trade amongst ourselves, improving manufacturing, industrializing? So that was a discussion. But that discussion has really been brought into a sharp focus now, because we have to realize that we are actually quite vulnerable. That while we thought that the important thing in terms of trade was that you produce what you are good at, what now we are learning is that also you produce for risk. So that actually in times of war, in times of crisis, when you have economic shocks that are global in nature, you are able to actually be self-sustainable. And I think we didn't take that very seriously in our planning, in our thinking. It was all about we do what we do best. Those kinds of discussions we've had as economists, and the training that we had about making sure that you play to your comparative advantage and the competitive advantage. But we are now realizing that is no longer good enough. We're going to have to do a little bit better. Now, I'm sure many of you, this quote on the screen is very easy to recognize. This is what the Reserve Bank governor repeats every single time he delivers his monetary policy statement. And really, he keeps telling us we have to do more, and in terms of restructuring our economy, making sure we make the structural reforms, that we're a country that is productive, that we get investment, that our potential to grow continues to be enhanced so that we can actually create those jobs. So it's certainly something that we've heard over and over. Yesterday, he repeated it. I lifted this from his statement from yesterday. And this is something that we've had over a period of time from him, and certainly many economists, many analysts, talking about the same thing over and over and over. And because we haven't done this, we have found ourselves in a situation where we find ourselves in that we are so vulnerable that we are looking at growth in terms of this coming year. Now, let's just think about SARB, and I'm going to keep it to the SARB, the South African Reserve Bank GDP forecast. So this is what they've been forecasting for the year 2020 in every meeting for the past, since say May, for the past 2 years. So in their May meeting in 2018, they thought growth would be about 2% for 2020. So these are looking forward. So in 2018, when they were looking to 2020, they said they think growth would be at 2%. By the end of, at the beginning of March of 2019, they revised that down and they thought maybe 1.8%. By the end of 2019, that growth forecast had gone down to 1.6. Then they kept going and going and going. And at the beginning of this year, they had actually taken it down to about 0.2% in the negative, so a contraction. And that contraction now is down quite dramatically. Now, I don't think we should be surprised by this, because we knew that we were not doing the right things, right? And a lot of people kept saying, when are we going to make sure that we invest in the country, we actually we diversify our industries, the mining sector does what we call manufacturing and value addition in terms of our minerals, so that we can actually be that much more robust as an economy, which we didn't do. I call this the hope gradient, because I think it represents really our hope, because actually in some sense, we know we're not doing the right things, but we hope things are going to turn out fine. And those things have not turned out fine, and they're worse. I understand now we are thinking about growth and looking forward in terms of a recovery next year. And that recovery is not going to be one that actually is going to be very easy, because we are still not doing the right things. At the end of last year, we know that last year we were in a recession. We also know that the sectors over the past 2 years, if you're looking at the graph in front of you, that shows us what we've seen in terms of growth over the past 2 years. This is average growth of the different sectors of our economy. Those ones in the red border represents 24% of all jobs in our country. And that actually includes agriculture, construction, mining, and electricity. These sectors have been in recession for quite some time. They've been struggling, and they're the only sectors that have seen growth. So we see growth coming from tertiary sectors. So those are mainly your services. Those are, especially your finance, real estate, and business services. Those obviously are the higher end job, as it were. Then of course government jobs, personal services. But those are and then in manufacturing. But certainly that area is where we struggle, because actually that's the area that needs skills, and we have not been developing those skills. And then we find our primary sector has been struggling quite a lot, and those are the low-skilled areas. So we have to think about, seriously, were we surprised to be where we are? And this slide I like to use, that showcases where our GDP growth is and how much of that growth therefore creates or is associated with job creation. And if you look at this graph, it shows you that actually, even though we've been able to grow, we're not growing at the same pace as we are actually creating jobs. And that's an important part about how we think about going into the future. I want to focus a little bit on this slide, because it's actually just a subset of our jobs. And this is the informal employment in our country. Now, informal employment really represents those jobs that when states say service people, They are not working in our banks. They are not working in manufacturing. They're not working in the mines. They are actually running their own businesses and are not part of the so-called formal economy. And over the past 3 years, this is an area of a proportion that has been growing in terms of our country. And we've been happy about it. I mean, many people like myself would tell you that we wanted these, enterprising, self-reliant people who are South Africans who are going to go out there and create their own jobs, find their own solutions. And that has been a positive thing. And many of us found that actually, while the government would say, no, let's register them, that we don't want them to be registered. Don't encumber their economic activity. Let them roam free and be able to be enterprising. And when we hit this crisis, the corona crisis, the epidemic, one of the things that has happened is that they've been the most vulnerable of people, right? Because they cannot participate in much of our interventions. And this has been a serious, serious fault line in terms of which we are actually responding to different communities, different sectors of the economy. And the informal sector is probably the hardest hit in terms of what has happened. And of course, we have found no solutions to support them. Now, we can't, as we go forward, have to think very deeply and very seriously about how we protect all sorts of workers. Now, we know we've had the issues of unemployment, we've had issues of inequality, whether it's wealth or it's income inequality. But those fault lines have been always evident. But where we have failed to actually see the line is, what do we mean when we say people should be enterprising? What do we mean when people should actually be finding their own solutions? And we always say entrepreneurship is an important thing. It also should mean that those people are protected and those jobs are protected. Now, these people are also the outside work. And we need to think very seriously as we go forward, because actually it undoes everything. Because which person will want to take the risk if, when things are tough, when there are economic shocks, they actually sit outside? And so we find that these people are now part of the millions and millions of South Africans who are without, employment or income that depend on the state. So we know that government dependence has been rising in South Africa since 1995 in terms of, well, I guess in the first instance, it's important to say that, the vulnerable people have been provided by government over a period of time, but that number is starting to increase. At first it was because we're starting to register new people, those who could not be. Now that has increased. And the importance of this, we thought that this number would rise to about 18.1 million by 2020. These were National Treasury forecasts. We now realize that number is going to way outstrip this expectation because of the vulnerability of people under this crisis. And this may stay under these conditions for some time as we seek growth. And this is an important part because I think our economy and our economy has been defined by a huge dependence on government because of the unemployment. Now, these people also depend on government at a time when we know that revenues are falling. We know that, I think at last count, they said about as much as a third of revenues expected by government are not going to be realized. And that's a huge amount of money because this is what we pay the cushioning of poverty, the cushioning of a crisis. And so we're going to have to think very deeply about how we go forward, how we actually find solutions both during this time and going forward. Now, while people will complain and say that we are spending money and we need to take care of the poor, as I do, we do find that a lot of our spending is actually directed towards what I would call redistribution, social protection, and actually forward-looking. We know, basic education takes a huge chunk of our budget, nearly 20%. By a fifth, we know we spend money on economic affairs, we spend this social protection. That actually, if you look at all those services, they probably constitute about over 50% to 60% of all spending for social protection and for social services and investment. But what we have failed to do is to make sure that those are successful, that actually we are turning the tide and that we are bringing people into employment, we are bringing people into economic activity, and that the numbers of people who are dependent on the government. And so what I'm trying to emphasize here is whether or not we have been able to bring together solutions that are actually going to be lasting. And that's the question we have to be serious about asking ourselves. And that brings me really to think about, for us to look seriously in terms of the relief package that the government has said, because actually it gives us a real sense of where we come from and where we think we are able to go, depending on the fact of what we are able to provide when we are in trouble. So we said we'd reprioritize 130 billion rand in terms of the 500 billion relief package that the president announced. That 130 billion rand means that we're going to take from different budget areas and give it this. Now, the question is whether or not this money will be relief or will be stimulus. And it's most likely stimulus, right? Because I think relief than stimulus, because we are at a time that we are still under lockdown. So whatever money we have still will not be able to actually, reach consumers on time, to actually build infrastructure, to do all the work that we know has to be done in order to take us forward. The government also talked about the 40 billion rand in terms of UIF contributions. Now, this is money that can be given to people who have had jobs, who have been holding jobs and been contributing, or people that actually have the protections of the structure that is provided by the structure of this economy. If you're outside of that, you are not able to benefit. But we also know lots of people have been complaining about the fact that while they too have been contributing, they are not being protected, they are not receiving any of that. There are all sorts of administrative glitches. I would like to suggest that actually part of our discussions should change about how we think about labor, how we think about labor protections, how we think about the mainstream, as the so-called mainstream economy, and how people are protected. Because when we come to a point of shocks, because remember, all of this is supposed to help when we get to these conditions. And to find that we have such serious teething problems suggests that really we have not been doing the best we can, or actually doing this work effectively. Then, of course, tax breaks. And we know, the first thing South Africans talk about, South African business talk about whenever they think about, economic stimulus, when they think about helping business investment, they always think, do tax breaks. And these tax breaks, of course, have to mean something about that they can give us the relief we need, but also that actually when we are taking the breaks, they can take us forward. So we're able to continue, though, to be able to invest, we're able to continue to support the economy, to support jobs, and to create new jobs. And I think that is part of our problem, in the sense that, do tax breaks work, and will they be able to achieve what we need to achieve? That's a question that I think will be very important as we think about the recovery and going forward. But there's also a very, very important question has been really about the 200 billion that the government has put forward as a loan guarantee scheme. In the rules that have been released, the main thing that it says it's for companies that were viable and will still be viable after this. Now, that's something that has concerned me greatly, because we know that our economic conditions have been relatively poor over a period of time, and many businesses would have been struggling. We know that the numbers that have come through in terms of business liquidations have been quite serious over a period of time. Many businesses have been defaulting. So we have had a serious problem in terms of many companies. So they may not be able to benefit from this scheme given those rules. So it plays really to the old economy, as it were, to those businesses that have always been doing well. But I think another thing to raise, and I'm glad I can raise it on this forum, is about those businesses that or those empowerment transactions. Remember, many of them to succeed depend on dividends. If we are not going to be paying dividends in the coming while because companies are struggling, how many of those schemes, how many of those businesses, how many of those transactions are going to survive this? Again, it's something that we should have thought about very, very much. Then the last thing is this idea of borrowing and continuing to borrow more, right? Because we're going to need to borrow more. And South Africans are not happy about going to the IMF and into other structures. We have to think very seriously about what borrowing actually means and how we borrow and where we borrow, so that actually part of our discussion is that we don't fall into a trap in which our borrowing actually starts to undermine our ability to engage in policy. And I don't mean by that, I don't mean this idea that the IMF is going to dictate to us, but in that actually every time you are able to borrow, you have to satisfy whichever lender you are, that you are actually good for that, and you are going to be able to live to their standards, especially when it's foreign borrowing. And I think that's an important thing. So our package really is important because I think it speaks really to all the things we can think about going into the future. When we reprioritize budgets, how do we decide where we reprioritize? Where are we going to focus in terms of both making sure we protect people today, but also that we actually reform our society, our economy in such a way that it is much more resilient than we have found it to be given this shock. And as I say, part of it is how we protect workers is going to be quite important, and certainly how we reform our manufacturing, how we reform our exports and imports is going to be something quite important, because clearly we have some serious fault line there. And then, of course, how we give support to business is important, and how we think about how the measures we've put together to mean that we want transformation, and how we actually borrow also means something. So I think those are going to be the most important things. I'm going to stop here because I think it was an important part to say every decision that we watch as that government makes today is going to be very important. Every decision that a business makes today is going to be important, because it will reflect where we go into the future, how things will change, how we're going to make sure that actually we make the relevant and necessary changes that actually put us on a better plane on the other side of this. And I think that's an important discussion I would like us to have today as we ask those questions. What are the lessons we've learned? What is the responses that we are already seeing? And are those adequate and putting us on a plane, on a path towards an improved and better South Africa that is free, is much more resilient and is much more self-reliant on the other side of this, and that protects all the people that actually work. So that's the kind of economy. And I think we are in a really, really serious test at the moment for both government, for businesses across the different sectors. How do we actually make sure that when another shock comes, we find ourselves in a better place? Because it will be something else, but certainly this is not the last time that we have been here. We know that that the last thing we discussed in terms of our plans was the Vision 2030, the National Growth Plan. That has had its challenges and its implementation. And that the last time we were discussing anything close to this was when the National Treasury, or what they call the deep strategy, was important. Modernizing, lowering barriers to entry, making sure that we want labor-intensive growth. We are focused on making sure that our trade policy pushes and supports industry and industrial development. We want to be competitive. We want to think about long-term rather than short-term pickings. We want it to be export competitive. And then at the same time, they said we want to be able to say all these reforms that we are doing, we're going to be able to quantify them. I think that we don't do very well planning and making sure that we are reflective of those things. So I'm going to stop there and allow for everybody else to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clanty. I think you've given us a mouthful, but one of the things is we want to bring it home to us as individuals, because the impact is not just a global impact, but whenever we talk about such pandemics, it is the individual that really is more affected than anything else. I understand that, Corona is a huge pandemic globally. I understand that it's affecting our country from a lockdown perspective, from an economy perspective, but what does it mean for me as an individual? And I think there are so many aspects to this. We're talking about the labor force. One of the things that we are seeing is a number of organizations shutting down, and that obviously means an influx of very skilled individuals that are going to be on the job market post the pandemic because of the number of retrenchments. Yesterday, there was a photo that was taken out from the CCMA at Fox Street, and the lines and the queues were increasing because the number of unfair labor practices that are actually happening. How do we then kickstart that economy from a labor force perspective? Is it an issue of, do we now go and reskill, learn new skills as individuals in order to be competitive? Do we now all go into computers and obviously then either become an IT technician? How do we then look at, from a labor perspective, deal with this and what the way forward should be?
And I think that an interesting part of that question, it really is about what we thought. I mean, a lot of us before this crisis thought the world was going into, what we call the fourth industrial revolution. But even in that discussion, we sort of thought that the world or this revolution will happen to us, instead of us actually preparing and being able to use it properly. There are some really good examples of what we found in other places where, for example, I'd gone to Israel, in which they decided that, for them, the fourth industrial revolution is about thinking about how they will, these robotics, for example, is part of it. How do they make robots do the work that people don't want to do and leave their high-level kinds of jobs? That will require, obviously, some reskilling, some rethinking of that, and that has been an important discussion. Certainly, we are now finding that an interesting bit, we are finding that actually the challenges that we face are now actually of very basic things that we needed, but still, reskilling is going to be important. I mean, imagine some of the businesses that are now have been affected by this, whether you think of yourself as in manufacturing, in property, for example, where people are now going to work from home. What are you going to think about there if your job is being undone? But clearly, retraining and reskilling. But that requires that we actually have a view of the future, that we think of the future of South Africa. Do we think we're going to be a nation of agriculturalists? Do we think we're going to be a nation of property developers, of miners? And then according to what we are planning, do we actually reskill? I think it's not going to be very useful, as I say, to actually say, do not have a view about where we think we are going, what scenarios we face in terms of our economic evolution, and then plan accordingly. So we don't train people in terms of just the idea that we think things are going to change. So this is why I thought that one of the problems we were facing when we were so focused on the fourth industrial revolution was a problem, because it really spoke to this idea that something is coming and therefore we must respond, not in such a way that something big is coming, a big change is coming. How do we then make sure that we actually therefore use these changes to better position ourselves?
Wow. It is indeed a big question for a lot of people who are sitting at home, who are saying, what next? I've just lost my job, or it's not looking too good. The economy, and just from a labor force perspective, I don't know whether I'm going left or going right and what I can do next. My next question to you, Kanti, is, when we talk about the township economy in itself, you mentioned that there are so many people who are now becoming self-employed, who form part of the, what we call the informal sector. The gogos, the who sit on the road and actually sell your vegetables. And they are not counted as part of the economy, but they form such a huge pivotal structure as in the economy. What about them? Because they are also part and parcel of our broader economy. They're sitting at home, unable to actually produce, unable to actually feed themselves. And the reality of it is 350 Rand doesn't really do much for someone who is a self-employed individual who has been working and making sure that the family has got some food on the table, and has now got to be dependent on government for that 350 over the period of lockdown. How do we then encourage them throughout this lockdown to actually start kickstarting their own economy?
I think the first thing there, as I say, is a vulnerability that many people who are actually working, people who are enterprising, are left when we face these challenges. If I think of, we've talked about the township economy, and that's been a very big thing. And then at the same time, we talk about spatial planning, and then we say, look, how do we make sure that people are able to work and live closer to work, and that the transport systems are actually built in such a way that people can get to work. And that I find actually in those discussions have been a bit polarizing, in the sense that in the first instance, do you want people to actually create industry and work where they are? So as you say, Gogo is there, or do you want her to be able to get on a bus, on a train, and go sell her produce in Sandton, for example? And these are important questions, because actually they talk about how we plan and how our interventions during difficult times will be. So if we think about spatial planning and we want people to be closer to work, then we should, the township economy perhaps is not our best discussion, because then we should actually make sure we're investing in people being able to transport themselves and get to the city. But if we are discussing something else, then we should not really be thinking about investing so much money to take people out of townships into these city centers, but actually creating economic activity where people are, so that we can say that 350 that has now ended up that will end up in townships when the government is able to actually deliver to people can be spent there. The manufacturing can be done closer to where people are for clothes, for electronics, for everything that it actually is within where people are. So you create economic activity there. That Ugogo can, if she is selling whatever she's selling, can go and sit outside a factory and sell. But if we are planning a different thing where people Ugogo must get on a bus or a train and go sell Amagwenya closer to center, then that also has implications, because of course it means that she has costs in terms of taxis or trains or all of these things. So I think the question now is very clear, whether or not we're going to make a decision about what country we want to be. Do we want township economies? Do we want them to be viable and vibrant? Then we might have to think differently about this idea of spatial diversification or spatial thinking, where we think, let's move people closer to the city. Because as we've seen, of course, that part of the economic theory that was very important in late 90s into the 2000s was this idea that people must come closer and be more densified, closer to work and closer to amenities. And when that happened, a lot of people, as we've seen in South Africa, left the rural areas. They left small towns into the cities, and that has created some really serious problems. So I think the point is really that our planning, we've got to decide what kind of country we want to be, what kind of economies we want to create in the country, and what kind of activity we're going to focus on. And that will tell us a lot more about what we do going forward. I think something is wrong. Your volume?
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
So I think one of my last question before I actually open it up to everyone else to ask their question is around policy development. We have all these weird and wonderful policies, the Employment Equity Act, we've got, the triple BE, where do we sit now? I think one of the things that COVID-19 essentially has opened up to us and has started questioning is, are our policies relevant to our country and to ensure that we do actually increase our economy and have a vibrant economy? Or do we need to now go back to our policies and say, what do we now do and how do we change, the way in which we implement our policies in order to make sure that South Africa becomes a vibrant economy?
Look, I think that's a very important question, and one that I've been grappling with for some time. We usually say, we've got the right policies, it's just implementation. I think that has been largely shown to be false. In the first instance, we know if we think about our education policies, people will always ask, people will say, look, is our education system delivering the kind of graduates or the kinds of skills that we need? I think by and large, a lot of people would say, well, maybe it's not fit for purpose. But again, it goes back to what that discussion we had, I was saying at the beginning, do we know where we are going? Do we have a plan? Do we know what we want, to achieve? And I suspect that we don't yet have a clear plan for that. So education policy, therefore, I would suggest is not appropriate for where we're going. So, and then I could go into, as I say, industrial policy, for example, must speak to what people need, what country we want to, what industries we want to focus on, what skills we've got, what skills we can build going forward. It can speak to, certainly what kind of homes we build for people, what resources have we got, where we put water, what we're going to do with the land redistribution programs, and where we're going to make sure that there's water, whether we are going to build our own dams, or we're going to use different kinds of modes, or we're going to think about sanitation issues. So there's a lot of questions that speak to the policies that we develop. But first, they have to be fit in terms of what it is that we think we're going to try and to achieve. So it's been very easy, I think, when I saw a question there about the National Development Plan. The diagnostic has been good over a period of time, but whether or not the strategy itself and the tactics to achieve that strategy are actually appropriate. I think if one thinks about this very crisis that we are in, we have a situation in which the government, for example, says, no sale of alcohol. And they put up the reasons why. And we will have to ask ourselves, are we still on point in terms of the question we're trying to answer? And that's always an important thing about policy, right? Is that you have a question and you crystallize the question and you say, the reason we're actually developing this is to achieve this. In our space, for example, we would say we want to deal with unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Unemployment and poverty tends to be related to each other. In what ways can we use that relationship to do better? And so if we think about alcohol, I think it's quite clear that, the government said we want to save beds. We want to make sure that people don't beat each other in the streets and end up in hospital. Now, there's no reason why you should then forbid all drinking, because actually we know where this thing tends to happen. It tends to happen in certain areas, at clubs, at clubs, whether it's clubs in Sentin, at people's parties. But those parties, right, because we are deploying some 70,000 soldiers, we are closing the clubs and the spaza shops. We are able to, sorry, not the spaza shop, the drinking spots. We're able to say, look, then those fights will be limited. How then do we make sure that people drink from home, for example? They don't socialize, so then we don't have that problem. So the point is, we know what problem we want to solve, and then sometimes we then say the way in which we approach the problem is the wrong problem. And that's a good example, I think, of our policy making sometimes, is that you can say, this is the problem we know we're going to have, but how do we get to solving that problem? And then we implement the wrong kind of thing, we implement it wrongly. So I think we are both, on both questions, our policies have to evaluate it exactly in those terms.
Okay. Thank you, Tanti. And I'm going to open it up to our attendees to ask a couple of questions. And Uspelele says that, is it really possible to grow labor-intensive sectors in the post-COVID world?
Yes, I mean, I think we have to think about it in that sense. So we know that in the agricultural sector, for example, that money, that's a very labor-intensive sector. And a lot of people said, well, if we are going to, for example, implement the minimum wage, a lot of people will be laid off. We've seen that actually that there have been different reasons for why people have been laid off, not so much for wages, but also because that would have meant that you want to, you'll be going to mechanize. Mechanization is also still quite expensive in South Africa. So a lot of these technologies are still expensive, are probably their cost above the wages. And so there is a possibility where we are in a sector and we look at that sector and we look at the labor environment in that sector, we look at labor prices, we look at competitiveness and other factors. You are able to say, look, this is a sector that can do very, very well in our ability to actually be labor intensive. And I think those are the questions that we need to think about. So certainly that is true. Construction, we're still going to make bridges and roads, hospitals and schools. Those are also labor intensive areas of work. In fact, actually, and also we found also some vulnerability of workers that are in that sector that do really, really well, who are actually in the informal sector. I don't have to tell you, I mean, we see all those sorts of pictures of people building, amazing homes. I know when we travel in the Eastern Cape, I've been to Limpopo, you can see in those areas what people are able to do in terms of construction. Now, how do we make sure that then we support that? Because I still think there are a few machines we can use that can build you a house. So I think it's that sort of thing that we need to think about and how we actually include people.
So around the importing and obviously exporting are not just of skill sets, but also material. What are your thoughts on import substitutes and obviously localization? And this is a question from Ustribo. He's really interested because he's in the agricultural space and he wants to know, your thoughts on import substitutes and localization.
It's a very important question. The first thing I'll say about this, when I was a student I don't want to give out my age here, but in the 2000s, early 2000s, one of the big things, especially from the mining sector, from the labor sector, was we want the rand to be weak. In those days, it must have been at 6 rand to the dollar. Then it went, it would be better if it was at 7 rand. Then it went to 7. It would be better if it was at 8. It will be more competitive, And we kept going and going and going and going. We know now where it is. And the question, therefore, was never about really the level of the exchange rate, but actually our competitiveness, how much we're going to invest and score good, right, in terms of our agricultural sector. I mentioned at the beginning that we make sure that we have we need water, we need irrigation, we need the science, agricultural science and scientists that can help us to make sure that we have an agricultural policy that is fit for the different areas of South Africa. I remember we have a country that has different climates, we have different soil types. We also know we can do different kinds of things. Also, that from there, we also, of course, have been talking about agri-processing and how we can build agri-processing plants, make sure that they are there's power to do that. We have got the right kind of technology and all of those things that make you competitive. I think our competitiveness has failed primarily because we have failed to actually provide the inputs that are part of that. So that would be training and skills. That would be, in agriculture, that would be water. That certainly would be the basic kinds of technologies and actually advanced technologies that are being used by other countries with which we compete. There's all sorts of opportunities in order to do that. And revitalizing old towns, of course, is very important because in some places we already have some of that infrastructure that can be repurposed for the purposes of what we're talking about.
Wonderful. So Tebogo's really going to put you on the spot this afternoon. And really, she says, when can we expect our economy to actually recover? And I know we haven't as yet peaked from a pandemic and obviously testing perspective. Do we expect our economy to actually recover in this year, or can we look at maybe earlier next year? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I mean, it depends what you mean by recovery. And I think this is a question that worries me quite a great deal. You remember at the time when we had these droughts in the agricultural sector, and I think it's a very good example, we had the sector decline by quite a large margin. I think there was a time when it was down 30%. Then, of course, after you come out of a shock, you tend to have growth, right? Because you are actually making up for what you lost. So if I produced 100 last year, this year I produced 50. If I go back to the 100 that I was producing after I had, the decline, then I'm at 50%. Now, would you call that a recovery? And people then celebrate that as a recovery as if it's something to be celebrated. And I think it's just getting us back to where we once were. And that's likely to happen as soon as we are able to open the economy and people go back to their ordinary things. So we can start in the last quarter, for example, but we get to level 1 by September, October. By December, we're probably going to be able to see some recovery. But I don't think that's the important question, because clearly we don't want to be where we were before. We want to be able to advance. And that's why I say our biggest question now is whether or not whatever measures we put now, whatever ideas that we are putting together, whether we're about what we're going to do to support tourism, what we're going to do to support agriculture, to support construction. Those should be the kinds of measures that don't take us back to where we were, but actually allow us to leapfrog ourselves into something better. And I would like to think that that's what we're going to do. We're going to put enough into the system to be able to do better than we did before, because we've learned how to do things. I mean, a great opportunity exists, for example, in the manufacturing sector. I think many South Africans, if you ask them, would they like us to invest in manufacturing capacity to do the masks and the protective gear from home? I think many of them would say yes to that. And that would give us an opportunity to revitalize, manufacturing and in a very big way. And so that actually when we get to the other side of this, we'll be able to do better. I'm just giving a simple example there, but this is the kind of thinking that we should have.
Ideally, we thinking and changing the way that we see our country and its economy is definitely going to be something that we as South Africans are going to have to do. I'm a firm believer that obviously the problems of the African child can be solved by the African child. And so, but it requires us to think differently. It requires us to think of different options that we can present ourselves as South Africans. So Lungile says the president has gone on an investment drive and incentivized private capital to come invest in our shores. Given what we know around investment and what needs to be done in order to unlock and maximize full value, have we identified which areas of our economy have potential for growth? Do we have the factors of production to supplement and accordingly align all our investment drive efforts and pledges towards that sector? This question obviously comes on the backdrop of increasing internal capacity and boost local manufacturing.
Yes, I think quite by and large we sort of know. And I think I would add to that what we have not, we've always had a problem because we look at our economy as one big conglomerate. So we want 3% growth, we want 6% growth. But I showed at the slide at the beginning that we have subsectors, and within those sectors, we have subsectors. So if you think about mining, for example, mining is an important part of our economy, but you can say, well, mining has been declined, but mining not all mining is the same, right? We mine different kinds of ore from, whether or not it's steel, gold, and the different subsectors are important for different kinds of reasons. And so when we have a plan and we look at that plan, we say we're going to think about construction, for example. We know that that will help us. Where in mining, that will be steel, and that probably will be quarrying, stone and all sorts of things, cement, that kind of thing. And then if you go into agriculture, my friend Randy Lester has talked about this in his book, that's out, which I encourage a lot of people to read. And in that book, he talks about the different kinds of employment-rich subsectors, and I think that's important also to say it's not just one big agriculture. It's parts. It's horticulture. Whether we are doing flowers, whether we are doing maize, all those things have different implications. So it really will require that we have a strategy. So it's about subsectors. It's about making sure that where it's possible, we do better. Where we can link to sectors or different subsectors, we do that so that we make sure that we actually we are clear about a goal and being able to lead that. But that really requires that we think seriously. That also speaks to different provinces and different endowments in those provinces, municipalities, the capacity. And I wanted to mention this, that in the reprioritization of government money, it's important because we must make sure that we reprioritize where there is capacity and where there is skill to be able to spend and to deliver the results, and not because we are hoping that we'll get something. We know that a lot of money goes unspent and then it sits there and it's actually wasted resources. We should be able to say, because we have a plan, of course, it's important to build capacity over a period of time, but also at the same time, we must work with the economy that we've got.
That's wonderful. So Mpa actually asks, what economic stimulus would you put together for South Africa to recover from past economic declines and the current pandemic? So maybe instead of 5 or 6 as she's asking, let's give about 2 or 3 things that you think government should actually implement that are done properly.
I showed in the slides, and maybe I will share them in the slides, the big plan, the Tito plan. I am in favor of many of the areas there in terms of, whether we're thinking about technology, agriculture. So that package is very good because it can actually lead us forward, again, depending on the different sets of inputs that we'll have. So I'd refer to that. I think it's a very good read. It's very encouraging that we have that kind of thinking. So I think I would refer to that and say, look, take a look at that, because it really talks about building infrastructure. It talks about telecommunications. It talks about all the key areas where we should focus, how we spend money, the effectiveness of that. So I think that's a great document. Obviously not taken in whole, but certainly it has the right kind of highlights. I wouldn't want to reinvent the wheel. I don't think it's useful.
So Brendan and Tato want to know, should South Africa go at it in isolation of every other nation from a recovery perspective? Or should we look offshore for economic growth? And as we look at foreign trade, is South Africa going to make it if we go by ourselves? Or should we honestly be looking at foreign trade to kickstart and jumpstart our economy?
More than that, I think that's a very important question. I worked I was involved in this review of the South African foreign policy document at International Relations, and one of the things there was what is called economic diplomacy, by which we mean, making sure that we have the kind of relations that serve our economic interests or our economic priorities. Now we know we've got dozens and dozens of diplomatic missions, so basically we are represented across the world, and in different countries there are different endowments, and they need different things. And that in that sense, if we negotiate, for example, again, a good example might be agriculture here, where we know people in the Middle East don't have a lot of arable land, and that therefore we could be producing food for them. So therefore, and they have money to invest in our agricultural sector. So if they were investing money for their own food, they would actually also be giving us that capacity to be able to actually use our land most effectively to plant and to export. And we know exports are a very good thing because they earn us dollars, they help with the exchange rate. So there are also possibilities they can create jobs, because obviously it will be South Africans who are doing the planting and the agriculture. They can, we can do high value products in terms of our agricultural sector. And then you can think of, arms manufacturing. We know we have the capacity, and there are some areas in the world where they need where we have diplomatic relations. So, and of course, we think about financing. So there's lots of areas in which we should not. It is no longer useful to think that we're going to look inward. I think the example that I was making earlier of local manufacturing should not be read as closing out the world. I think that would be a mistake, because we have these relations. We have these relationships. I mean, if you think about the Germans and their contribution to South Africa during this time, is an extension of a hand in collaboration and cooperation. And we have a very good relationship with Germany, who manufactures our cars. Where we get a lot of cars, where we manufacture German cars here. How do we make sure that that relationship is better improved, better benefits us, better make sure that we actually can do more? I think the issue now is how we negotiate to get better outcomes. So I'm quite convinced that there's much more we can do.
Okay, so Khomza wants us to go back just to the NDP and obviously the Tito plan. With obviously the NDP, a well-written document, however, we're experiencing implementation challenges. And obviously with the Tito plan, is it realistic when we compare the two from an implementation point of view? Should one of them be scrapped and we go with the Tito plan going forward? What is your outlook on that?
Look, the NDP is supposed to be a strategy document, a sort of a broad framework. Then you take from that, then you say, well, this is the broad framework. How do we then implement its parts? So, for example, it talks about building skills, that we need to build skills, and that's an important thing. Now, how do we build those skills? Where do we most need skills, and how effective we're going to be? So basically that we don't have a basic one fits all kind of skill sector. So we build a skill sector that's fit for purpose. So it speaks to that. And I think it would take us, for example, to then the relationships we have with, say, a China, a Germany, that have very, very good skills in terms of, the Germans in terms of technology and what they're able to do in manufacturing. So how do we then bring that in? So it's about then the nuances, the different kinds of interventions that we need. So as a broad framework, as a broad strategy, it's great, but what it needs, therefore, is to be distilled into usable parts, into practical parts, or tactics that take us forward. So you don't throw it away. It's a great document. What is important there is how you actually make sure that it works. It's much like the Constitution. You don't take it in itself and say it's going to achieve itself. You have to make sure that it actually does. We do a little bit more work in terms of the nuance, in terms of the detail. And it is where I think we haven't done well. And I think if you then take it to the Treasury strategy, when it talks about prioritizing labor-intensive growth, and it talks about agriculture and services, we have to say, okay, if we think about services, then we're talking about tourism, for example. And in tourism, we know one of the key things is that people have to get to those places. So there are some really, really beautiful places. I was with a friend of mine, actually, we drove from the Eastern Cape last year. Couldn't believe, I grew up there, but I couldn't believe how beautiful some of those places are. Many of them are unreachable. So we need small roads that will go to these towns. If you've been to the Western Cape, the road system to those small towns where you can spend a weekend has been developed. And I think that's an important part. So we say services cannot be supported without infrastructure. So yes, it's a great plan. So how do we build the infrastructure there? How do you make sure the electricity and water so that people are happy to go and visit? It speaks to different kinds of things. When you talk about competitiveness, I've spoken about this, that we want a competitive country. What is actually behind what we mean by being competitive? That's important because it speaks to teaching skills, to actually investing in technology, in new technologies for people to be able to compete with their counterparts in other parts of the world. And that is something that we're going to have to do. We're not going to say, a manufacturer or a farmer in the Eastern Cape by himself is not going to be competitive if they are not supported with the right kind of technology, with the right kind of storage facility, the water. So all of those things are important, and we have to do them. Some of them speak to collaborations where people work together to be able to work in terms of economies of scale, for example. Those are important interventions that speak to these broad frameworks being practicalized or made to work. So I think we don't throw them away. We work at them to get to the other side.
So unemployment is going to be, a big issue within South Africa, and not just because of COVID-19. We're already coming onto, from a situation where unemployment of youth is extremely very high, and now Premier Makura actually says is very positive to say 890,000 job losses in Gauteng. That's what we are going to see. What do you make of his statement?
It's absolutely true. Look, I mean, we've had really a difficult thing. I mean, a shutdown would mean that. Remember, unemployment is an effect of production, of doing things. When you are sitting at home, you're basically not doing anything. So we define unemployment as not, you're sitting at home, you're not looking for a job. So therefore, if you're sitting at home and not looking for a job, you're unemployed. And that has been true, or you're not working. And that has been true because of the regulations and certainly because of the lockdown. Then that caused, of course, an erosion in terms of, certain businesses. And that means, therefore, that's not something we're just going to turn on. Even if we were to open, for example, tomorrow in restaurants, some restaurants are going to find it difficult to go back to full capacity immediately. So that is going to be difficult to do. That's true of manufacturing, because if we open the manufacturing in full, there are no orders because people haven't been ordering whatever it is needed, whether they've been ordering clothes or different kinds of machinery. So that is going to take us some time. So that unemployment is going to be something that's going to increase and is going to be with us for a bit of time. But again, as I say, it's about how we then plan to sector by sector. I wish we will, that each sector will give us a recovery plan worked out with the supportive government institutions to make sure that we are now leapfrogging ourselves. So we're not just thinking about recovery. So I would say, for example, in tourism, it would be great if the people in the tourism sector say, look, we've seen our weaknesses. We've seen how things can go badly. Government, we would like you to support us in this way, not government to lead that charge. And then government looks at that and says, okay, how do we work together to create the kind of environment that you say you need to leapfrog? I think the issues in manufacturing are well documented. Again, many companies say, look, we think this thing, actually, our health system has to change. Our opportunities are going to be there. We're going to think very differently about our health going forward. I don't think it's going to be the same. There's no way we're going to think the same about property and how we go to work. I find it difficult to think that I want to ever go back to the office. I think I could work from home. And so do I need office space? Probably not. And so people with office space are going to have to rethink that and be comfortable thinking about the fact that maybe we need to rethink office space into lovely apartments that have been sitting in the middle of Sandton. So those kinds of things are going to be important. So again, it will require that we are very smart about how we get together and craft new solutions, new revolutionary solutions to take us forward.
Kanti, thank you so much for inviting to us this afternoon. Yes, not a one-day conversation, conversations that we're having with each other as say thank you.
Thank you very much.
Then I will make the presentation available to all our attendees just to have a look and obviously create more momentum on these discussions. We will have, as BMF Soweto, further discussions and dig deep into some of these sectors that we have been talking about. But from us, I give you the quote this afternoon and you said, come together is beginning. Staying together is success, and working together is success. So the only way we will make South Africa a success is if we all come together to have these discussions and ultimately have plans that we can implement going into the future. I wish you all a wonderful weekend, and we thank you for joining us for this webinar.
Thank you.